you don't get something you don't aim at. Often people will keep their goals fuzzy, because one of the problems with specifying your goals is you specify your failures, right? If the goal is really fuzzy, you're not sure when you fail, and then you can fool yourself. You can kind of keep it foggy, but you make your goals sharp and clear, then you know what to aim at. And what's interesting is, your brain is set up so that it reorganizes the world around your aims. And that's not, I've also written about this in 12 Rules for Life quite extensively, and that's not a metaphor. Like, we don't see much of the world. We see what we aim at. We aim with our eyes. And so we're hunting creatures, like we're aiming at a moving target and trying to track it all the time. And so you have to specify your aim, and the Future Authoring Program helps people specify their aim. And it's more than one aim. It's like you have a highest aim, which you might say is to be a good person. And then I would say, well, there's a more elaborated aim than that. It's like you want to be able to constrain malevolence and work to decrease suffering. It's something like that. That's the highest aim. And then you have to decompose that into the things you do each day so that there's a definite connection between all the micro actions and the macro aim, and then that gives dignity to what you're doing. So the Future Authoring Program anyways helps people lay out a plan, and I always suggest to people that they do it badly, because you're not going to do it perfectly, and if you get perfectionistic, it's going to stop you. When you first start to plan, you're probably only going to be about 20% right. But the difference between 0 and 20% is immense, and we found with our research that even people who only spend an hour on it benefit substantially in their ability to stick to what their next plan is. One of the things I tell people, so you say write down what you're going to do the next day before you go to bed. That's good, because then you've got a direction set when you wake up in the morning, eh? But I've told people to learn to use a schedule. And people often hate schedules because they act as their own tyrants, right? They say, well, you have to do this unpleasant thing, and then here's another unpleasant thing you have to do, and then you have to do this unpleasant thing. And you do that for about 3 days, and you think, to hell with this, I'm not doing that, and you fall off the wagon. That isn't what you're supposed to do with a schedule. You're supposed to use it to design the days that you would like to have if you were taking care of yourself. And so some of that is, you wake up in the morning and you think, here's 5 things I have to do that if I don't do, my life will be worse. It's like paying bills, for example, or taking out the garbage. It's like you have to do those because otherwise things degenerate. So you got to put some of those in the schedule, because otherwise tomorrow is worse than today, and that's a bad trajectory. But you also want to build in things, you've got to act in some sense like you're dealing with a relatively recalcitrant 9-year-old. It's like, well, here's some things you have to do, but here's some things that if you do, you could reward yourself with. And if you get the balance there between obligation and reward right, then you'll find that you're motivated to do the things. And that's what you want to do. You want to do that so it's sustainable across days and weeks and months. And so you got to treat yourself like a good boss would treat a valued employee, and not like a tyrant would treat a slave. Because the slave will rebel. And people say, well, I don't follow through on my plans. It's like, well, A, they're probably not very well formulated, and maybe you're doing them because of an external moral obligation or something. They're not really your plans, right? And B, you're acting like a tyrant and a slave, and that's a bad relationship to have with yourself. So you want to treat yourself with the same way. That's the golden rule, right? Treat other people as you would like to be treated. It works both ways. You also treat yourself like you treat other people properly. So that's a necessary thing, and often people don't do that. But the scheduling is really important. Well, and everybody kind of has a sense of where they would end up if they let things auger down. And everybody has their specific weaknesses that their faults would exploit. And some people would end up homeless, and some people would end up with a physical illness or a psychiatric illness, and some people would end up addicted, and some people would end up cruel. But everybody kind of knows where they would head, because they've seen it. They've seen it rise up. And it's really useful to be terrified of that as if it's a possibility. Not only is it a possibility, it's actually a rather high possibility. And so you have to make that realistic enough, which means that you have to take an inventory of your weaknesses, let's say. You have to make that realistically enough so you're actually terrified of it. because then that's a great motivation. In my clinical practice, people are often faced with tough decisions like, well, I'm not happy at my job and I'm afraid to leave it. It's like, fair enough, that's a big deal, okay? How afraid are you of not leaving it? Let's lay that out. Because, one of the peculiarities of human thought is that you do get used to the devil you know, and then you downplay him. But it's very often that staying in the same place will do you in. It's much worse than the risk that you'll take. But you really want to think through the cost of inaction. And that's something people generally don't do. And this is also one of the useful features of having a tragic view of life, let's say. Because most of the time, often, you're screwed either way, but you get to pick which one. And that's a big deal. It's like there's risks on both paths, and they're major risks. And that's actually freeing because there's trouble both ways. So that frees you up, because if you think, well, this is the safe path and this is the dangerous path, well, then you're not going to take the dangerous path. But if you think, well, I've got danger A or danger B, and this is where I would rather bet my future, well, that's way better. And I've had many clients that I've helped with their careers, and we do exactly that. It's like, okay, what's our goal? Our goal is to triple your salary in 4 years. You think, well, that's not possible. It's like, well, we'll try for doubling, but you don't know, it's possible. Let's get it together. And you got to get over being afraid of looking for a job. You got to get over being afraid of being interviewed. You have to put yourself together so that you've got options, and then you got to start to push. You don't know, you might be able to do it. Well, it's quite surprising how frequently that works. And that assumes the people are trying, right? They're competent. It's not waving a magic wand or anything like that, and it takes a lot of work. Like if you're going to switch jobs, you might have to, I figure 50-1 failure to success. It's something like that. And it's useful to know the baselines as well, right? Because looking for a job can be very disheartening unless you know the baselines. It's like, well, yeah, 50 resumes for one interview. Don't take it personally. It's just how it is. So it's not that you're a screw up. It's that there are way more resumes than there are jobs. And then, don't look for a job for 8 hours a day, because you'll only be able to do that for 3 days, and then you'll die. You look for a job an hour a day, if you already have one, for an hour a day or half an hour a day for 3 months. 2 resumes a day, 3 resumes a day. You'll find a job. Because, then you've got some hope, and hope is a big deal. You can put up with a lot of misery if you've got hope. But if you think, I'm miserable today and I'm going to be miserable tomorrow, and next year I'm going to be older and just as miserable, it's like, that's not good. But if you think, well, I've got a plan, that's a whole different story.
Dopamine is not about the pursuit of happiness. It is about the happiness of pursuit.
Right, that's definitely right.
There is no destination. Each destination is simply the beginning of the next journey.
There's technically 2 different forms of reward. There's consummatory reward. And so that's the reward. That's what an orgasm is. It's consummatory reward. It brings the behavioral and perceptual sequence to a halt. It ends it, right? At the climax, it ends it. But then it's over. That journey is over, right? Then there's the dopaminergic reward that Sapolsky was talking about. And dopaminergic reward is evidence of advancement towards a goal, right? Okay, so there's a corollary to that. Well, how do you become optimally engaged? Because dopamine facilitates engagement and focus, which is why drugs like amphetamines can be used for kids who are attention deficit disordered. Tap up the dopamine response, they lock on. Okay, so they're locking on to a goal-directed pursuit. The problem with amphetamines is that they can lock you on so hard you can't get out of the frame. So, like kids on amphetamines will obsess, for example, about cleaning up their closet. They can't switch to the next activity. Okay, dopaminergic reward is reward that's accrued in relationship to a goal. Okay, so what's an implication of that? Well, pursue the highest possible goal. Well, why? Because the kick from advancement is higher. Now, you have to advance, right? Because imagine the reward's got 2 components. Number 1 is you're moving towards something valuable. Okay, so you want it to be as valuable as possible. Okay, but You have to be moving. So it can't be so valuable that it's out of your reach.
If I'm going to walk to the moon, I'm not going to be able to see every single increment that I make.
Yes. You want to get to the moon, that's right. You can't walk there, so it's a bad plan. You need something extremely valuable that you can move towards. Okay, so part of the reason that you establish a relationship with God, let's say, is because that's what sets the upper bound to your vision. It's like, I want things to be the best they could be. That's a vision of paradise. Well, that has to be fractionated into, your proximal decisions, but lurking behind that should be this continual movement towards, what would you say, a heaven that recedes as you approach it. That's the proper vision of heaven. A heaven is a place that's perfect and getting better, both at the same time. That's what music shows you, because a great piece of music is perfect, but it's just getting better as it unfolds. And you need that. This is part of the problem with a static utopian vision, something Dostoevsky criticized. If you gave people nothing but consummatory reward, he famously says, so that they can do nothing but sit in tubs of hot water, eat cake, and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, human beings would break that all to hell in a moment just so they have something interesting to do.
What was that quote? If we were to make the world sufficiently perfect, the only desired lack would be for the desire of lack itself. What's that?
That's Kierkegaard.
What's the proper? Can you remember the proper?
Well, Kierkegaard pointed out that as we make the world easier and easier, so this is perhaps part of the problem with the material plenty that's at hand, is that at some point, what becomes lacking is lack itself.
Yes.
Right, yes, exactly. It's optimal deprivation. And if everything is delivered to you on a platter, it's like, what the hell are you even doing there? This happens in the story of Abraham. So Abraham, who's the father of nations, right? So Abraham gets it right. He has everything at the beginning of the story. He has rich parents. He's got nothing that he has to do. He's like 70 when the story opens. He's been taken care of hand and foot his whole life. And the voice of God comes to him and says, I'm the God of your ancestors, telling you, get out of your zone of comfort. Get out into the world. And Abraham's pretty old by this point, but for whatever reason, he decides that he's going to forego the comfort for the adventure. And then as Abraham progresses, he makes the requisite sacrifices, each becoming more difficult as he ascends. And he adopts this pattern of relationship with the God that calls him to adventure that literally makes him the father of nations. And so Abraham adopts a mode of being, a sacrificial mode of being, that establishes the optimal environment for his sons, who then establish the optimal environment for their sons, and their sons, and their sons. So you can imagine that what Abraham is doing, this is what the story means, is he's adopting a mode of behavior that works best, all things considered, across multiple generations. And he sacrifices everything to that. Truth. Truth is what's optimally difficult. The truth is optimally difficult. It's a really wonderful thing to know. The truth is adventure. There's no distinction. Partly because if you're going to just say what you believe to be true, you have to let go of the consequences. You can't predict the consequences. Well, there's no difference between not being able to predict the consequences and having an adventure. They're the same thing, right?
Because if you knew the consequences, it wouldn't be an adventure.
It's not an adventure if the consequences are foregone.
The same as it's no sacrifice or courage if there's no risk.
Right. It's exactly the same. And so it's a wonderful thing to know that optimized adventure is to be had in the truth. Think in every given situation. So Christ says in the Sermon on the Mount that to orient yourself properly, and it's often viewed as this hippie paean, take no thought of the morrow will take care of itself. God takes care of the sparrows, he'll certainly take care of you. It's like a hippie wet dream. That isn't the core of the message. The core of the message is very straightforward. Christ says, aim up to the highest thing you can possibly imagine. So that's the relationship with God. You put what's at the pinnacle, properly at the pinnacle, and you aim at that. And then you concentrate that and treating other people like you would like to be treated yourself. That sets the moral frame. Then you attend to the day and the cares of the day. It's like once you've established the proper moral frame, you pay attention to the day and you live in truth. And that moves you towards that destination. You have to have the orientation right. You have to be aiming up. But then it's just a matter of abiding by the truth. That's the logos that sets people free. And that's right. So Christ tells his followers in the Gospels to store up treasure in heaven, not in the places that moths can eat and rust can destroy. Well, what is meant by that? Well, it's meant by if you run yourself through a disciplinary process, so you accomplish something. Maybe you don't attain the goal you were aiming at, but you accrue a new way of looking at the world and a set of skills. Well, if you just keep doing that, you have multiple ways of looking at the world and more skill. That's your storehouse of treasure.